Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Finca Soledad Wave Natural Processed Ecuador from Hydrangea Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Hydrangea, based out of Berkeley, California. And before we start, I wanted to give massive credit to Hydrangea on how much their bags have improved over the years. And for those of you that remember, when Hydrangea first started out, they did have those oversized brown bags. But since then, they've made the transition to both this as well as the pink bag with the really nice artwork to go on the front. So I just wanted to give them massive credit, as I do find these to be a lot more appealing than the bags that they first had and a significant upgrade. They are actually some of my favorite bag designs out of any American-based coffee roaster. But Hydrangea is a coffee roaster that has appeared on this channel on numerous occasions, including our recent review of the Finca Soledad Pepe wash processed Ecuadorian coffee. And of course, we purchased these coffees side by side, as this is actually the one that caught my interest a little more. And that's largely because we're yet to review any of Pepe's natural processed coffees. And as a matter of fact, we've reviewed very few natural processed Mejorado coffees over the years, as they're still not necessarily the most common coffees out there. So it's definitely going to be interesting to see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 46. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a hybrid recipe of ours and Hydrangea at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 93 degrees Celsius, about 199 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee, we did discuss it a little bit more in our previous Hydrangea review, as we highlighted that they have roasted a bit lighter since they transitioned from the Probat to the Loring, and that is definitely apparent within this coffee, as once again I wouldn't necessarily say that they're the lightest roasting coffee roaster out there, but they're still a bit lighter than they used to be, and I often describe their coffees as being maybe on the lighter side of that light medium, kind of within that range, as most of the coffee roasters in that light medium range I feel like have just a slight bit more development than this one. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, first impression through the V60, and the coffee was notably clean, as it didn't offer too much of the heaviness, rather opting for a bit more brightness than initially expected within a lingering sense as well. Feels like the coffee is still a bit too fresh, which was also the experience I had with the washed coffee, as it's mostly offering a generic feel, so I was just kind of happy that it didn't come out too overbearing from this first impression. It's definitely going to be interesting to see if that changed, as on day 19 we opted for the Chemex, and there was a little bit more fermentiness in the cup itself, as well as a slight grainy quality and a red tone to it as well. The listed apricot did feel apt, as there's a stone fruit presentation in a bit more sugary of a sense, with a pretty intense cup all around, so this time I could say you're feeling a bit more of the processing within it. Day 22 through the April brewer, and the coffee is the most balanced, intense, but also fermenty that it has been to this point, as the stone fruit quality is presenting itself a bit more in a heavier sense, with a slightly lingering herbal aspect to the florals and a slight bit more brightness to it as well. So just a bit more intensity in pretty much everything that we had experienced from this coffee up to this point. Day 25 through the V60 with Hydrangea's recipe, and the coffee is a bit of an adventure, as right off brew it's a bit cleaner with a slightly more floral experience before transitioning into a slightly more red fermenty tone before cooling off into a cleaner stone fruit sense, ever changing with an intense tropical and herbal feel. So this one was a bit of a roller coaster at times, as you could definitely feel this coffee being very well layered, as you can definitely differentiate a lot of the characteristics within this coffee as it transitions from right off brew all the way to the point where it cools down. So that was, I would say, at least interesting, even if a lot of those aspects weren't necessarily things that I was enjoying. Day 28 through the Chemex with Hydrangea's recipe, and interestingly, this is the best the coffee had been to this point, as there's less of the red fermentiness and better definition to the listed apricot. There's also a prominent yet heavier, lighter florality presented within this coffee, so they do have a marigold note listed on here, and that makes a lot of sense given that the florality presented within this coffee is definitely on the lighter side of things, but not really a white floral aspect to it. There's a slightly lingering fermentiness nonetheless, so kind of mixed impressions, even with this one being a bit better than some of the earlier days. Day 31 through the V60 with our hybrid recipe, so we did go for that 16:1 at 93 Celsius, and this was actually the best coffee I'd been to this point, as it has notably less of the fermentiness, skewing a bit more towards the Mejorado brown candy sweetness. though it was presented in a more intense natural-like sense, which I did have mixed impressions of because the main driving point for a lot of these coffees is that they're that clean and intense while still offering that level of sweetness. So relatively high on the florality, but it's presented much more in that lighter sense, yet again in line with the listed Marigold. Day 34 through the Chemex with our hybrid recipe, and it seems to be working a bit better with the natural version of this coffee as it's interesting off brew, and that's kind of the direction we went with both of these Hydrangea coffees, was going in that hybrid recipe, because I felt like it's somewhere in the middle, like we're really close. It needs a little bit more extraction than the Hydrangea recipe, but it needs less than our standard recipe, and that was kind of the case with this coffee. It seems to just work better within this coffee. It's presented in a slightly fermenty sense yet again. However, the cool down does offer a more red berry reminiscent of what I would describe as a cleaner maraschino cherry. So that was kind of interesting. I don't think, okay, they do have a hawthorn note listed on here, and I think that's the only kind of red tone that's listed, but I definitely felt a fair bit of that kind of natural red sense to this one. Day 37 through the V60 with our hybrid recipe, and the coffee has been slightly inconsistent as it's not as good today, with the focus being a bit on the strong yellow florality complemented by tropical brightness and more of that red fruit component, and I honestly just ran out of space to write more notes on this one. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a handful of level 4s, so let's go through those, and we'll start with the finish level 4. That's one of the more interesting parts of comparing these two coffees side by side, is that the washed coffee had much more of a long-lasting finish than this one. But that's to kind of say that this coffee is not necessarily overly natural intense in the sense that it's just very lingering and long-lasting and too intense. Overbearing is the word I usually use. So level 4 actually works just fine for me on this one. Sweetness level 4, it definitely has a fair bit of that natural-like sweetness to it, but even then, this one presented a little bit more of that Mejorado-like quality to it than the wash processed version of this coffee did, so I want to give them credit for that, as it is kind of interesting that there was a little bit more of that, we'll say, Mejorado-like sugary sweetness to it. Acidity level 4. And that's another interesting one, is both of these coffees presented a higher level of acidity, though I probably expected it within this coffee more so than the wash processed coffee, but it still also had a little bit more of that kind of citric and tropical brightness presented within this coffee. They were kind of similar, but I mentioned in our previous review as well that Hydrangea seems to have a pretty distinct profile to a lot of their coffees, and that's usually the way I describe it, is within that brightness, as it seems to be consistent, not just with the coffees that we've had from them since they made the transition from the Probat to Loring, but also the Probat coffees that we had from them in the past. Florality level 4, and that's one of the things I highlighted a lot throughout this review, is that there's a pretty prominent, I would say, not just yellow florality, but there's also a little bit of that herbal kind of component. I could see red florals presented within this coffee as well, and if anything, it's probably the highest charting thing within this tasting wheel. Berry fruit level 4. Probably my least favorite aspect of this coffee, given that it is presented in that red berry sense. Hawthorn again is what they had listed on here, and I could definitely see it being a little bit more tart, but at the same time it had a sweetness to it that was, as mentioned, reminiscent of maraschino cherry for me at time, but also that kind of generic red berry fermentiness that's also present within a lot of natural processed coffees. A couple of level 3s. We will start with the citrus fruit level 3. Don't quite recall any sort of citric note that was on this description. I think, what was it, hawthorn, and I just described the other ones, marigold, and then there was one more thing, apricot, that's what it was. But as far as citric qualities go, I would say it was a bit more of a generic citric tone to it, nothing that necessarily stood out. And then the stone fruit being there at the level 3, I could definitely see it being reminiscent of that apricot, given that it was presented in a more sugary sense. However, the longer I continued to work with this coffee, the less I felt any sort of stone fruit qualities, as it was a bit more reminiscent of all of the other things I discussed, that florality, that red tone to it, even a little bit of that Mejorado, like either brown candy as well as honey-like sweetness to it. And then the final and possibly most important thing worth discussing is the cleanliness level 3. I've heard more people discuss this coffee than I've heard discuss the Pepe washed version of this coffee, and it is kind of interesting to me that people continuously highlight this coffee as being very clean, and I can see it that it's slightly cleaner for the average natural processed coffee, but I wouldn't necessarily by any means call this coffee a super clean coffee, as you're definitely feeling a fair bit of the fermentiness throughout the entirety of it. And given that this coffee does use so far in the red sense, and it's so interesting to me that people point out that this is a pretty red coffee, and at the same time they still say that it's cleaner in general. Usually I associate that very strong red tone with not necessarily being overly clean. So I feel like that's a result of the fermentiness to it. So level 3 is where I opted to put it, though. I do have to say, still a little cleaner than the average natural processed coffee, but nothing that would justify it scoring any higher than that. So as I am looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. This is kind of a great opportunity to discuss both of these Hydrangea Pepe coffees together, as I feel like I struggled to get the best out of both of them, though I feel like I was a little closer to getting the best out of this coffee when compared to the other one that we had reviewed from them. And I do have to say that this one was probably a little bit more interesting, largely because it was a natural version of one of Pepe's Mejorado coffees, and for that reason I was offered a different profile than a lot of the other Pepe Mejorados we've reviewed in the past. And at its very best, I did enjoy this one a little bit more than the wave washed, or I guess the Pepe washed, which is kind of interesting given this coffee is probably a little less my profile to begin with. I just think I liked the uniqueness that this coffee did offer, as it had still plenty of sweetness. It was a little bit more balanced in general, as the tasting wheel does look a little bit more even and toned down. So that's probably my best highlight about this coffee. Now, the type of person I would suggest this coffee to, I feel like it goes in a number of directions. So the first place I have to start is that it does still offer a fair bit of those red tones to it. So berry fruit being there at that level 4 mark and the cleanliness being there at the level 3, that's a little bit of a cautionary tale, because I know that can be a put off for some people. It usually is for me, but I think it was made up for by the very prominent florality that was presented within this coffee, as well as the high level of sweetness, a fair bit of brightness to kind of balance and counteract all of that, while at the same time being cleaner than your average natural processed coffee. So I feel like that's the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not yet subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Finca Soledad Wave Natural Processed Ecuador from Hydrangea Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.